Well, welcome back, everybody. Oops.
You need to be turned on.
I guess so. Sorry. How's that? Is that better? Okay.
Yes.
Welcome back, and this will be our closing. So Marshall is going to be here in a second. He comes from his other class, but we thought we'd go over some of the, oh, and there he is, right on cue. We thought we'd go over some of the big points again to hammer home, and then we looked up some individual sites that might be of interest to you if you want to go do some further research, and Paul's just told me about another great one. And then we thought we'd also have some time for discussion, because I know that several of you have had points that we wanted to talk about, but there wasn't enough time as we raced through our other programs. And for one, I remember Gullah Geechee we want to talk about, and there may be others. So we'll save time at the end for that as well. So Marshall, are you up first or am I? I forgot. You are. Okay, well, we have to stand near here because there's only one of these. That's for them.
Oh,
this
this
is
one.
for...
Reverberation.
Yeah. No.
Can you hear? Oh,
There we go.
there's feedback.
Might be because yours is on.
Is it because I'm too close? Oh, I'll turn mine on.
Just have it up too loud.
Or is
All
this
right.
the- all right. You can tell we're not
Well, you're now
technically
turned
up.
off.
Okay.
You are.
Yeah.
She's off.
That he's still on.
It's just that your voice is a little louder than the mic is ready to pick up. So she's going to turn on the volume in the background.
And I can turn this back on?
No.
Apparently not. That's you.
It might be the electric mic too.
I normally don't use wood.
I think that's fine. I think it might be feedback from the electric mic.
On this one. All right, how's that?
That's very good.
I can hear you.
All right. Is that okay, Gertrude? Yep. Still like in a cave. We gonna go with this? All right, well, I'll try it, but it's gonna, because we have the other one.
That's independent.
If I move over here, it's gonna be better. I'm wandering around, looking for,
She's going to bring it down a little bit.
okay,
And this one he needs for that machine.
okay. So the reverberation's up here.
That sounds better.
Yeah? Let's see if I walk over here, if it's doing any different than still.
It's not bad anyway.
It's all right.
Can you guys hear me okay without that mic? Yeah. All right, well, here, I'll put it here. Maybe there'll be less feedback. All right, so here's still.
It might be the feedback. You might want to turn your ears off.
All right, well, I'll just talk in my normal speaking voice. This is active. Okay, so what we thought we'd do here, we only have 3 slides. I think that's right.
I think so.
So we've been through 5 weeks. So what I'm going to do is briefly summarize, give you an overview. I always do this in all my classes when I always joke. When I was in high school in Houston, in the late 1960s, I hated my history classes. What do I do for a living now, right? My 11th grade history teacher was probably spinning in her grave. I used to sleep in class.
Oh, Marshall, I don't believe it.
Yes, I did. I literally slept in class. And part of my dissatisfaction was we would sort of, you never quite got past the Second World War. And this was, late 1960s. It had been a little while. Part of this actually was ideological in Houston. You couldn't teach about the United Nations because that was a communist conspiracy, and so they had to leave it. So they just sort of would stop in 1945. Okay, the world's finished, right? But it always irritated me. It was just history's one damn thing after another, right? But it's not. It's a pattern. And as I always say, history is not the facts, because First of all, there are too many of them. And second, we never agree on them. And third, what history really is how you put those facts together. It's interpretation. So you got our version of this particular subject. If other people had taught this, you'd get a different version of it. And they would have picked different issues. So the sort of logic of what we did here was say, okay, let's start off and give you a big picture. There are lots of world diasporas, people moving out from places. But this is one of the most notable. And so as these people move out from Africa, where do they go in the Americas in particular? But we emphasize that they're not simply coming to the Americas. There's millions of people who are forcibly being brought out of Africa. They're also moving east into what today we think of as the Middle East, into the Indian Ocean. Right? So we sort of said this, but that's not what we're focusing on. We're really interested in the Americas. So we tried to sort of make the point that slavery is something which exists across all time periods in all places in the world. So what we're looking at is slavery, the modern transatlantic slave trade, and its impact. So this really begins in the late 15th century as a part of European overseas expansion across the globe. Slavery exists in Europe. Sub-Saharan African slavery exists before 1492 on a fairly small scale coming into particularly Spain and Portugal. But once Columbus comes across the Atlantic in 1492, what you get is this irreversible, ongoing process in which you connect up the old world of Africa, Asia, and Europe, which has long been interconnected. You connect them with the Americas, which had lived in isolation from the old world for thousands of years. So part of this transatlantic exchange that takes place is the forced migration of millions of sub-Saharan Africans across the Atlantic, but this goes on for centuries. That everybody's involved in this. Nations, polities, ethnicities, religions, everybody's engaged in this. And in particular, there are types of slavery in Africa before the Europeans show up. As Jane emphasized, different slave regimes have different notions of what slavery is, and that matters. Right? So not all what we think of as slavery in the United States in the 19th century, especially the legal regime. So that the sort of my first session was sort of, okay, let's show you why all these people are coming across the Atlantic, where they come from, and where they go. And we emphasize in particular, although Africans end up all over the Americas, from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, right? The huge concentrations are on the coast of Brazil, especially what is northeastern Brazil, and then in the 18th century, southeastern Brazil, the Caribbean Basin, right? Which is all sorts of political entities, islands, mainlands, and then what is the U.S. South. And so that those are the three big plantation slaveholding societies in the history of the Americas. The Portuguese and Brazil are sort of the creators of this system. Then the Dutch, the English, the French, and on a much smaller scale, other peoples move into the Caribbean and recreate these societies. And then the United States, what becomes the U.S. South, comes into this process. And then by the 18th century, all of these major plantation slaveholding societies are functioning simultaneously. So that's why when I had those graphs, right, the vast majority of Africans who were brought across the Atlantic come across in the 18th century, primarily on British ships. Right? That the slave trafficking gradually squeezed beginning in the late 18th century, is eventually stopped. And then eventually the slave trade, the slavery itself is gradually extinguished, beginning with the abolition of slavery in the British West Indies in the 1830s, the American Civil War in the 1860s, and eventually Cuba and Brazil in the 1880s. So it's really not until the end of the 19th century. So then Jane came in and said, okay, let's look at slavery in Spanish America. So here is this sort of system, the kinds of opportunities and kinds of labor exist. Then I came in and sort of said, okay, let's look at Brazil, Portuguese Americas. After all, that is the most important part of the Americas. So, and in particular, in Brazil, what you see is this enormous plantation society. So in numerical terms, right, and something Jane will talk about here in a second, the impact, right, Brazil is bringing in millions of slaves from about the late 1570s all the way into the 1850s. Right? So much longer, in larger numbers, and much later than most of the other slave societies. So that means that the impact of Africa on Brazil, especially northeastern Brazil and the area, southeast Brazil, say Rio and slightly north of there, is much, much more powerful than what you see in a place like the United States, where slavery begins late, takes off in a big way relatively late, and the slave traffic is officially ended in 1808, 4 decades earlier than Brazil. So the United States is maybe 800,000 slaves are brought in. The Caribbean Basin, it's 4 or 5 million. Brazil, probably about 4 million. So in terms of the size of those slave societies, the U.S. South, in numerical terms, is the smallest of those 3 great systems initially. Although in the end, what happens is the slave society of the United States, British, when Jane talks about British America is really not only the U.S. South, it's also those islands in the Caribbean. So there's this great arc, right, moving from Nova Scotia down to, I don't know, Trinidad, right, a British settlement. And in some ways, the U.S. South looks more like the Caribbean than it looks like New England. Right? White planter society, slaveholding, that looks a lot more like Barbados than it does Boston. Right? So British America really is this huge arc. Then we sort of said, okay, if you look at the 18th century, the most striking, massive form of resistance, even though, as Jane and I both pointed out, you have resistance taking place all the time from the moment people are attempting slavery, people are enslaved in Africa, all the way through their lives in the Americas. There's constant ways in which people can resist. The most dramatic is to fight back, to rise up and rebel, and the most dramatic of these rebellions is in Saint-Domingue in the late 18th century, where you get several 100,000 slaves rising up, literally destroying the plantation society and pushing out most of the few whites that are there. And that this has an enormous impact because it has an impact far beyond Saint-Domingue. This means all those other slaveholding societies really batten down the hatches, especially the U.S. So the slaveholding system in the United States becomes more and more rigid after the 1790s because they have witnessed Saint-Domingue. French planters have now settled in places like South Carolina. They know what this is like. And so this gives you a sort of sense of the broad overview. And so what we're going to do now is sort of say, okay, here's sort of main takeaway points, I guess, and open it up for you guys to ask questions about anything, because I'm sure you guys have questions. All right, you go.
So, is this me now? Okay, so this is, again, as a sort of a recap, again, the big points to hammer. We tend to come into these studies always with what we know, which is the antebellum South, and we have these images from Gone with the Wind and Roots and Amistad and so on. They're very powerful visual images that it's hard to get past because they've left such a big imprint. So we just always have to remind ourselves that that, as Marshall says, is a small part of the picture in numeric terms and in global terms. But it is important. We study it and we want to know about it, but it is the better known of these stories. So that's why we don't do that in this short class. And then Marshall's already told you that most of the slaves ended up in those plantation societies, and we wanted to say, again, sugar tends to be one of the driving forces of this horrible economy because it consumes people. And it is why you had to keep bringing in new people to those areas that had to produce sugar. It's a very profitable economy, but it's labor intensive and capital intensive, and but it kept making money, so people kept, bringing more and more slaves in. And so anyway, there's sugar in that coastal area, hot coastal areas. We had those big populations. And then again, Marshall said how long everything lasts, centuries of it. And we had those sort of artificial dates of 1807, 08 up there. 1807 is when Great Britain said no more slavery. And they celebrated themselves for this humanitarian move. The great abolitionists, you might have seen the movie William Wilberforce about him. It was called Amazing Grace. And those were wonderful, heartfelt abolitionist types. However, as we always counter, the revolt came from below, and they came into it late to say this is inhumane and we ought to stop it. And finally they do in 1807, and they say, okay, no more slave trade. That doesn't mean no more slavery. So as Marshall points out, in the British Caribbean, where there was already that huge investment in sugar, slaves, and plantations, they don't get rid of it for another 30-some years, and then there are these sort of systems of post-slavery kinds of retentions of labor through apprenticeship programs, and they're always trying to drag their feet on it. Oh, well, we can't quite throw everybody into the regular population. They're not quite ready for freedom yet. And so in most of these places, there are these stall moves that they do about putting in a lot of vagrancy laws, for instance, and then you could pick anybody up off the street for anything. Pass systems where they have to have paper to move around, work contract requirements, you have to be employed, all sorts of new laws about behaviors so that anybody can be arrested. And that happens everywhere from the U.S. to Cuba to Brazil. And so you have a lot of convict labor that then you can cycle back into these places and rent out to planters that still need the labor. So when we say final abolition and end of slavery, we don't really mean that, because there are all these other systems that still are a disguised form of slavery. And we had it in the U.S. too, in, for instance, the tar camps and so on in timber camps in Florida. Those went on well into the 20th century. Zora Neale Hurston and Stetson Kennedy were still interviewing convict laborers there that were cutting timber and doing tar and turpentine like they did in my period of Florida, you know, so it goes on. So when we put these dates out, they're sort of anniversaries on paper at least, but it doesn't mean that slavery is over or that forced labor is over. Okay, 1807 was Great Britain's great anniversary, and 1808 was ours. But in both cases, the slave trade, even though it's supposedly abolished, goes on. And in our case, the U.S. Civil War sort of ends it, because we have that whole Gulf where ships can come in any little bay, you know, from Texas on over to Florida and unload hundreds more. And up the Atlantic coast, they were still doing that too, right up to the Civil War. And there was also a huge trade, illicit, into Cuba, right up to the end of their wars of independence. And the same was true in Brazil. And the same kinds of fictions of liberation happened whenever the British ships or the American squadrons would intercept an illegal slave ship. They would liberate the slaves, and there was always, you know, liberation supposedly. But then they'd cycle them back into work on public roads, on public buildings, whatever, in Brazil and other places. So despite the global effort of the British and Americans to supposedly stop that trade, the trade goes on. And also, well, we'll talk about that. We'll talk in a minute about memory, but keep those dates in mind for that discussion. And so then we wanted to think, if it's centuries of African people coming into all these places, what are the big impacts of that demographic shift? There's the demography, you know, bringing in all kinds of new people and all of the different populations that result as a, you know, from the mixing of Europeans, Africans, and indigenous people in all those places that we talked about. The economic impact. I'm not an economist, and maybe Marshall can address this, about how much profit is made on these poor people's sweat and blood, and how it uplifts countries like Great Britain. They make their industrial revolution on the sweat and tears of the people they brought in earlier, and then they say, and now we're done with slavery, it's an antiquated system. Once they're on a roll with industrialization, then they can get, you know, righteous about it. But so there's a tremendous economic impact from all that free labor for all those centuries in all those places, doing the infrastructure of all those places, then the economic production of all those places, whether it's sugar or it's mining or it's whatever, and continuing to produce and produce and produce with almost little expense. You know, they'll always talk about how little they have to spend, one suit of clothes a year and minimal amounts of food and so on, which is one of the reasons there were some sort of escape hatches where you could work on Sundays for your own maintenance, that kind of thing. And then there's tremendous political impact, as Marshall points out, from the all the rebellions are met with political fear and concern, and lots of military effort and expense that way to put down revolts, and political shifts as rebellion happens, and sometimes takeovers of certain parts of the Americas. Maroons, those runaway slaves that I talked about, are a constant threat outside the urban centers of all of the colonial places. They're always lurking in the mountains, and everybody's always scared and always reporting, and it's a constant. But sometimes they rise up and carve out pieces of the countries for themselves. So in Suriname, they fought the Dutch down to a treaty which gave them a piece of Suriname. In Jamaica, they fight the British down until they get a piece of Jamaica. It's theirs to keep. And the Black Seminoles, I would argue, pretty well got a chunk of that territory for a while at least before they're displaced westward, and still have some areas. So there's political effects from all of this hundreds of years, and then there's tremendous cultural impact too, from bringing in everybody from so many different cultures, so many different language groups, so many different religious backgrounds and so on, and mixing it into this stew in the new world here, that especially in those places that we talked about with heavy African populations, there's a cultural imprint that you see today. And so we can all talk about that some more, but I mean, sort of the obvious ones are always in foods, in music, in religious practices, and so on. Those are some of the things that we can think about and beyond. And then we've studied it, and obviously you all had some interest in this topic, but there's tremendous global interest also in the stories of the African diaspora. And sometimes it's people looking for their roots, as we saw in the film roots or the television series roots. Sometimes it's historian geeks like us trying to look at the history. Sometimes it's just wonderful educated people like yourselves that are interested in this past and trying to understand it. But there is a tremendous interest in it globally now. And there are some agencies that are assisting in the recovery of this history. Sometimes it's through historical research that they fund things like my project, and then I get to go out and do the archival work and eventually write something about it and put it out there for other people. Sometimes it's museum exhibits or films or teaching materials, programs for teachers and so on. So what we do as scholars, at least on this subject especially, I feel a tremendous commitment to give it back, not to make it just in a footnoted book that only 6 historians are going to read, but somehow to feed it back into a bigger population of people, because I think it is so important for our national health to deal with these issues and for our global health to deal with these issues. As we're getting global, we need to know how to work with each other, and we need to know how long we've been connected, and I think it's a real important thing not to just keep it in the realm of high scholarship. So there is a lot of research and a lot of support for it in getting it out through agencies like the National Endowment for the Humanities that have funded a bunch of my things and others. They fund teacher programs and they fund things for the Humanities Center on campus. And all the states have a Humanities Council that puts on public programming throughout the U.S. that's funded from the National Endowment for the Humanities through the councils of the local states, which have just all kinds of wonderful programming. And Tennessee has a Humanities Council too. So I am a little concerned, and I throw this pitch out here now, that the National Endowment for the Humanities is under assault in these hard budgetary times. And I've just spent all my yesterdays writing letters to our representatives to say, please don't cut it in the big budget things. It's minor, and a nation is judged also by its cultural contributions. Not everything is as valuable, maybe, but in the big scheme of things. But I think it's important. So, and some of those agencies are funding archaeological explorations and investigations, such as some of the ones I showed you globally, for looking at how actually it was to live as a slave on different plantation sites. All of our presidential homes have had some archaeological work done, so Jefferson's and Washington's home and Jackson's home down the road have all had some archaeology of their slave quarters, and that's been funded by these kinds of agencies and provides, again, new material to feed back into the public school systems and public history. And so I put other there to think about what are other things that we could think about that might be other ways to look at the recovery of this history. And one of the ways is the United Nations has a very great interest in this because, as Marshall set us up, it's a global system, it's a global problem, it's a global shame that we had all of this. And so the United Nations, through UNESCO, has, way back in, I think it was 2004, created a Tracking the Slave Route Committee. And so that people from all the different nations were encouraged to try to address their own local histories. So it was launched in Benin, but it's gone global. And they have meetings every so often and compare notes and put up educational materials and so on. So it's a global effort, I think. I think I had another slide now too. So here, talking about memory again. Memory, mine is getting shorter and shorter, and it can be very flawed. And some of these sites are also flawed, but we can get some things from all of them, I think. But the idea of memory I wanted to return to because in 1807, remember that Great Britain said, okay, the slave trade's over. They had huge national celebrations and programming from the Queen down about we abolished slavery, we called an end to slavery. All of the museum exhibits were focused on that moment of 1807 when they finally said enough. But it didn't do the hundreds of years before where they had benefited from the slavery. So it was a very interesting shift in the focus to the moment of the end without the moment of all the before. And I don't think that was as true. In our case, we just almost didn't do anything in the anniversary of 1808. I don't remember. Does anybody remember much of that? Maybe it's my flawed memory, but I don't remember that.
There was
we didn't.
more in Britain.
It was Great Britain. Great Britain took the credit for ending the slave trade, but never talked about their own complicity in it. So I put up some sites here. Marshall, do you want to do anything with any of these, or do you want me to just run through and then we'll open it up? Okay. So here's some. That UNESCO one I put up. If I just click on it, do I just hit it, Marshall? Yeah. I picked the page that had all these different exhibits and all different kinds of museums. If you're interested, you can follow it on your own. As I said, some of them are a little iffy. That one up on the top, the virtual visit of the Goree Island. This is a private individual, some of you may know, who has created a museum of his own house to say this is the slave, the last, the door of no return is sort of what he says. And he has sort of created his own idea about it. It is actually a building of the era, and Goree Island did see slaves come through there, and many of them were held in the basements and so on of these homes, but a small number in comparative terms. The misery, I'm sure, was equally bad, but there's no water on Goree, so you did not hold millions of slaves on Goree. But so that was a little bit, it gives you a picture. So some of them are a little bit more authentic than others, but each one of those other ones, like the Harriet Tubman Institute, named after our famous slave heroine who came back and retrieved and rescued a lot of her friends and kin and others, they have subsets of all kinds of other material within them. So you could fish around in these things forever, and I put some of the ones that would give you the biggest feedback for your time and effort if you're interested in any of those subjects. So a lot of museums, including the Liverpool Museum in Great Britain, which was one of the big slave ports, and others. So Cuba and Brazil are in that one on Places of Memory and the Slave Route. Our National Park Service has created a program called Network to Freedom, which tracks the Underground Railroad, which everybody always used to think was always to Canada in the 1850s, and we've pointed out in this lectures that it was a route southward a long time before it was a route northward. So they have our Florida sites on this memory as well. And so that's one. These are some of the others. You can see naval archaeology. You can see the Schomburg Center in New York, which has a great collection of documents. The Yale Slavery and Abolition Portal, all sorts of them. And a little uneven, but they're all up on the UNESCO, so I put them all up. I mean, I just copied that page for you, and if you're interested, you can get a lot of information there. Okay, so that one is one. Oh, what did I just do, Marshall? I just got out of our slideshow. Let me put it down here again. The Library of Congress, our Library of Congress, where's my arrow? There it is. Also has...
You have to go back from current slide.
Oh, from current slide? Okay, I'm sorry. Library of Congress has also a nice collection. That's a lot more... you can have a confidence in this one because it's been vetted by scholars and so on, and if you wanted, you could search by subjects, authors, and so on. All the legal cases from 1740 to 1860, rare books and legal cases and so on. I'm just going to do it like this and maybe so that was one I thought might be interesting. This is a great site here that the University of oops, that's not the one I wanted. National Park Service, I mentioned, has their network, and you can go all over their map and see what sites were the sites for runaway slaves in the U.S. and in the Caribbean. I wanted to get down to this one. This one is a wonderful one that the Virginia Humanities Council, speaking of humanities, created at UVA. And Jerome Handler is the person who came up with it first. He was an archaeologist of slavery in Barbados, and a very interesting person. And this is one of my favorites because you can look up by subjects, you can explore the collection by subjects. All of these subjects are by keyword, and then they give you these beautiful images if you're ever interested in the artwork or the maps or the whatever, and they give you the citation for where that image was found so that you could then read the books and so on. And so that's a great one. I love that, and I use it a lot in teaching. And I thought since we've done some archaeology, this is a good site too. It's an African Diaspora Archaeology Network, and every month they have new issues. This one is sort of the 2006, I must have had it up, but there's Jerome Handler, who was doing his slave burials in Barbados and found an African healer with a wonderful array of jewelry on and special objects that he had in the 17th century in Barbados. So it reminds us again that culture continues even in an enslaved situation. If we had a person of such prestige buried there and they allowed him to keep all of his jewelry and his pipes and his bracelets and so on. So that one has everything from new work in Africa to new work in the Caribbean to work on slave medicine and on the U.S., and I think it's a good one too. And what's this one? Oh, this one is mine. I wanted to show you. This one is a really good one. This one is one I've been scrimping and getting money for like 10 years now. My first big chunk was from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and they had a collaborative research call for applications, and I got partners in Brazil and in Canada to help me be part of this, and then we directed here, and thanks to Paul and Flo, we have had a long-term commitment from the University Library to maintain this site. And it contains the oldest. We start with church records first because they're long serial records. You don't destroy those. You try to hang on to them. And we started in Cuba first and in Brazil. And they're the oldest church records and the oldest records, really serial records, for Africans in the Western Hemisphere. And we have them here at Vanderbilt. And then we got smaller grants from the British Library Endangered Archives Program, which is a global program, and it's privately funded. The British government has no money for this anymore, or never did, I guess, but this private foundation has given us several different grants now to extend this work into Colombia. And then I got some money from the Catholic Church in St. Augustine, finally, to digitalize those records, which are the oldest in our country. And they go to the 16th century. So the very first Africans, baptized, buried, married here in the U.S. are in those records. And they'll be available online now pretty soon, too, for everybody to work on their own. Of course, they're just the images. It's digital, so you have to learn how to read the stuff, but we're trying to, eventually we'll sort of maybe crowdsource and get some people to do translations, but for right now our mission is preservation, because when I went back to Cuba the next time, a lot of the things were already missing because they've crumbled. It's heat, it's disease, not disease, it's heat, and it's bugs, and it's water, and it's fire, and it's poverty, and it's everything. So if we don't preserve them, they'll be gone, and that's what this project is about. And then we try also to digitally preserve and make a record of all the art in these churches, because those get stolen and those get gone. And so we try to put teaching materials up for people and photo galleries, and you can wander around on that site if you're interested. And last time Paula Covington checked, which was like last year for some other grant we were doing, there were like 40,000 hits in 6 months on that. Of course, maybe they were just looking like that. I don't know. But there are some dissertations coming using these materials. So that's one that I think we can say is unique. And then, what's this? I wanted to show a Brazilian one from Salvador. My partner Maritza from Brazil in Rio has a great site, too, that you can link to through mine. But this one is one also in Salvador, the Bahia, which is, the most African place next to Africa in Brazil. And they have had this wonderful center called the Centro de Estudos Afro-Orientais for like 50 years, and they produced a journal all that time, which is also online in Portuguese, and images and art and objects there. That's a good one. We just had João Hayes come and talk here. Oh, shoot, I did it again. Current slide. And he's one of the founders and a very important scholar in that. Okay, and the last one is the Brazilian National Library also has a special site for the study of slavery and images and maps and slave sales and all of the rest. So do you want to come on up and we'll open it up for discussion?
Can you go back to the list of the websites?
Oh,
So I
sure.
can write them down.
Oh, and Norma's there.
Which
Norma's
one?
grandchildren arrived, is it?
I'm sorry?
She was going to...
Oh, Norma's grandchildren arrived?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Twins.
Oh, when?
Yes.
I knew there were twin boys.
Liam and Pierce.
Liam and Pierce? Wow, great names.
But we're going to give all the PowerPoints to Norma, so she, I
That's
guess
right.
you guys have a site where she...
Yeah. Put them on posters.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you still want it? Okay.
Yeah.
I
Unless
don't
you're
remember
using it
where
for something else.
No. I just don't remember where it was. Where it was eventually.
Which one are you looking for?
The master site. The master list.
The websites.
What's
Is
it?
this
Go
it?
back, just go back to the PowerPoint icon.
Go back to PowerPoint.
Okay, there we go. So we'll just open it up then for questions and discussion of any of these subjects.
The great majority of the blacks in Brazil speak Portuguese.
Yes. Yes, they do.
Can you tell us a little bit about the awful part of the business, the equation that took place in Africa, the people gathering people, capturing them, and selling them?
A lot of people, a lot of our African scholars look at this because we know very little about the sub-Saharan trade north to North Africa. We know it existed and it was a different kind of slavery. Usually it was to hold women and children in households, and it was a different sort of setup, sort of a more luxury kind of thing. Out the Indian Ocean, as Marshall mentioned, we're starting to get a little bit of study being done in certain parts of the receiving areas there. But what we focused on was the Atlantic slave trade, and that is triggered by demand. So when the Portuguese first come down there, down the coast, they are trading, they're really looking for gold, I think, as we showed in that very early episode. Gold is the draw, and spices, another very big profitable trade. And so Malagueta pepper and other kinds of spices. Ivory was a big draw, and you'll see beautiful Portuguese salt cellars and jewelry and so on made from that time period. And then they say, oh, and we'll pick up a couple of these people here and take them back. And they get fought off in the beginning. But eventually they get a few people and they bring back translators and they go again, and it developed a market in Lisbon, then Seville. And so it starts to grow from that small Portuguese beginning. And then other African scholars look at what are you trading for these people? Well, one of the things that was a big draw, guns. Another big draw, horses. And so this gun-horse cycle is one of the things people look at. So those were luxury goods that important Africans could control. And what do those two things do? They allow you range and more military ability to go conquer other people and keep feeding them back into the market. And so not we, but the ancients stimulated the demand by providing material that was something unique in Africa. It wasn't that they ever went in and conquered, because Europeans died like flies from the disease cycles there. They would be coastal. They would establish a factor. This is a Portuguese feitoria system where you leave a guy behind to run the trade. You cut the deals. You had to pay to be allowed to stay there. So Africans were in control of that trade. And that's something sometimes it's hard for African American audiences to wrap their heads around, but that's the truth. And the demand was created, however, by the Western nations that are developing all these plantations. And so the trauma and the horror spreads everywhere that Europeans go, because they're going to be coastal, but they're going to keep pulling people out those Atlantic coast ports to send them off to the Americas.
Do we know if whole tribes were basically ended because you took all the viable males out and nobody else could survive?
Well, that's a great question. There's certainly trauma, as we saw on this side, from the indigenous population collapses, and people regroup. And so how much cultural blending and shifting, and Bill might know better than I, that whether somebody actually disappeared, but new forms of cultural connections happen out of that. And I think one of the most interesting ones for me, you should talk some, is in Congo, Angola, this group called the Imbangala, or sometimes they're called the Jaga, are sort of a group that I find interesting because they're really scary people who have sort of lost their ethnic identity and band together in these militarized groups that throw people into slavery and come down and burn down villages and capture people and sell them out, and supposedly don't take any children with them because they might be a hassle to deal with. And so they've just got this horror. There's allegedly cannibals, and all of these horror stories grow up around them, but they are a product of the slave trade themselves. And they cast off their ethnicity, their own individual identities, to follow the military captain of their gang. And so I think of that as a potential model for my maroon camps, where I find within my camps a war captain of the Angola nation and the Congo nation and the Mandinga nation and so on. And they're all under one group, but they never would have been associating before. And so I think it's sort of an African model for the same kind of militarized new identifications in the New World.
I don't know of any cases of a whole people being taken away because of more of it. But the problem is the data.
Yeah,
because
where do you get
this
that
occurs
information?
in 1550. We don't have the record of those people to start with.
The other thing that's sort of interesting.
It makes it more difficult, especially the acephalous, the non-state groups that were often the target of African states.
Mm-hmm.
And you have raids from this state and this state. And my quip to my students was, but this kept the states stable because they didn't have contiguous frontiers. But it didn't help people between them who were the target of many slave raids.
There's an interesting book now about Guinea Bissau and the Bisagos Islands, about how those small stateless people kept getting pushed, hiding actually from the slave raiders, the bigger, more powerful states that would come after them on horseback. And so what they do is move to mangrove swampy areas where horses are no good. And they have to develop a whole new architectural style, a whole new planting style, a whole new everything. They have to adapt or die, and they do. And they just move. And so all of this movement around Africa is reminiscent to me, of them finding new ways to adjust and adapt in this world. Marshall, do you want to
I would say I would use the parallel of Native Americans too, because we tend to have this notion, oh, here are the Comanches, here are the Apaches. But if you really look at this across time, there are lots and lots of different bands and groups of people that are constantly forming and fissioning off and creating, so that when we look at, for say, 1870 on the Great Plains, are peoples that are there at that moment, but they are the culmination of lots of other mixing and matching that's gone on for a couple of hundred years. And before there were horses, and I always say this to my students, like, our image of these guys on horses in the plains, there are no horses before the Spanish show up. Right? And so the Comanches are something that emerges out of, in the 18th century, people learning how to domesticate and ride these horses better than anybody else can. And so at the moment they're conquered, that's what they look like. But if you look 200 years before, these things we call Comanches didn't look like that, and there were lots of other groups. So my guess is in Africa, probably what you're seeing is across time, these groups are shifting, and you got new ones forming.
But even within the tribes in southern Africa and in the Sahara, they did disperse into smaller groups for survival because they were hunter-gatherers. And after the Europeans put all these people together, they couldn't really all feed themselves, and a lot of them died from diseases. The Europeans really stayed in the coastal areas because there were forts there naturally, but a lot of them didn't go into Central Africa because they would die from the diseases, and the Africans later on proved that.
And that's right. We mentioned John Thornton here a couple times. I'll promote him again. Our notions of Africa tend to be the 19th century, right? So Stanley and Livingstone and partitioning Africa. Well, the reason it's the 19th century, it wasn't until the 19th century Europeans had the ability to go into the interior of Africa, survive, and conquer. So for most of the history of the slave trade, they're staying along the coast. And there may be small numbers of these guys moving in the interior, but Europeans physiologically will not survive in the interior, they'll die off. The technology they have is not enough to defeat the peoples in the interior, so it's the repeating rifle, the steam engine, and quinine to make it possible eventually to go in these. And so then what do? They draw those goofy lines that we now have on the map, so you put all these different peoples within these imaginary borders and say, this is Angola. This is Rwanda, right? And those are inventions of the late 19th century, but for most of that period of the slave traffic, there's all these groups forming, reforming, shifting, hunting and gathering societies, large imperial systems, and everything in between.
Can you quantify the distribution of the slave trade? You know, that slide earlier said that the antebellum South was a small part, and that Brazil and Caribbean Basin and Cuba were. Can you put percentages on those?
Yeah, I'd say,
roughly?
I mean, the usual overall view is from roughly, say, early 1500s until about the 1870s. Best estimates, especially using tracking the slaves database, is that probably about somewhere between 12 to 15 million Africans arrive on this side of the Atlantic alive. Right. And I think I mentioned this earlier, the Joseph Miller, who has this great book called On the Angolan Slave Trade, tries to come up with a calculation. Again, it's this issue of problem. You don't really know how many people are there. There's nobody taking a census. There's nobody tracking it. His best estimate for 100 slaves captured in the interior of Africa, by the time they arrive on the shores of America, half of those are gone. So that probably for the 12 to 15 million, you're saying originally that was somewhere around 30 million people captured and enslaved. By the time they arrive here, it's 12 to 15 million. The usual sort of estimate is about 40% of those people end up in what today is the nation of Brazil, that political entity. So Brazil easily, in that sense, is the largest recipient as a political entity. If you put all of the Caribbean basin together, right, all those British, French, Dutch island stuff, it's probably about that size, about 40 to 45%. So those two zones, and that's why today, if you look at Brazil, especially Rio up to northeastern Brazil, and you look at the Caribbean, the imprint of Africa is visible everywhere. The U.S., the estimate is probably somewhere around 750,000, and that comes out to somewhere around 5 or 6% of the total traffic. This is why, for people like us, this drives us nuts. When people say African American, they really mean African U.S. But if you really mean African American in the true sense of the Americas, the vast majority of the African diaspora is outside of the United States borders. And then the rest of them are distributed all over the place, especially in Spanish domains in the mainland. So you can find Africans working in mines in Bolivia, and haciendas in Mexico, all over the place. Bert.
How much do we, did the slave trade draw on southern African tribes, the Zulus, the Bantu, that sort of thing? They did not.
The Eastern African people from Mozambique show up in our records sometimes.
At the end.
At the very end.
Not really south.
So.
One thing that we've hardly touched on is that the African natives of Africa who came over were intermixing with European and to a lesser extent with Native American stock. And the curious legal definition, at least in the United States, of a Negro is 1/8
One
Negro
drop.
blood.
One drop.
Well, it became, though, 1/8. There was a case in Mississippi not so terribly long ago, 30, 40 years ago, in which miscegenation was charged because a man had married a woman and it was said that she was a Negro, whatever that means. And the case was dismissed in court because it could not be proved that her great-grandmother was actually pure, whatever that means, African. And so that she was 1/8 African, but maybe not pure African. So it was dismissed.
Well, we touched on this a bit when I talk about Brazil. Race, the phrase goes down, is socially constructed. There is no biological basis for it.
Right.
So, but we construct it. It doesn't mean it's not real, right? Because we believe it, it's a reality, right? And in each part of the Americas where you have Africans arrive, the way in which that's constructed differs. So what tends to happen in the United States, racial mixture takes place everywhere. And you're now going to, this is why you now get all these people doing DNA testing on Oprah and Skip Gates, and everybody's like, okay, 1/3. Racial mixture takes place everywhere. What happens in the United States is the system becomes increasingly rigid, especially after the Haitian Revolt. So I think I mentioned this when I talk about Brazil. In the United States, the category of a mulatto, or racially mixed, exists in the U.S. Census up until the beginning of the 20th century. And it's taken out. So what you see is racial boundaries in the U.S. get increasingly rigid, and you're either black or you're white. There's no in between. Brazil is very different from this. Right? In Brazil, racial mixture takes place. The numbers are much larger. And what develops in Brazil is a much more fluid spectrum. The people are somewhere along a spectrum of black to white. That system is incredibly fluid because all the prejudices that come into it, social, cultural, linguistic, economic, determine where you fit. Literally, your color depends on all these factors. So that you cannot be black and rich, by definition. Right?
Or educated.
Or educated in black. So what you tend to see in Brazil is there's this kind of incredible spectrum where racism still exists. It's really color prejudice exists, not race. Right? And it's a mixture of socioeconomic as well as color. In the United States, what we get is a system that's much more rigid. This is why the civil rights movement succeeded, because African Americans could see themselves as all the same. Right? Because no matter what your economic status was, you were still black. That does not happen in Brazil. It's a frustration for black Brazilians who want to create a solidarity movement that most people say, well, but I'm not black. Right? That's a cultural choice, not a racial genetic category. So all across the Americas, you get variations in the way in which people perceive what we call race. On the Brazilian census, it doesn't say race. It says color. And you only have 4 choices. You're either white, black, mixed, or yellow, which is normally used for Asian Brazilians and Indians, Native Americans.
I think I'm pink.
Yeah, so in this sense, you have an incredible flexibility. It doesn't mean prejudice isn't there. It means prejudice is more subtle, more nuanced, and more difficult to root out, right? People will not say, oh, I don't like him because he's black. They go, oh, well, you know, I don't like what he's got. It's because they're poor, it's because they're not educated, they speak funny, because of the color of their skin. And this is why I argue what we're seeing in the United States is the Brazilianization of race relations. The more and more racially mixed the United States is, people start saying, I'm not black, I'm not white, I'm mixed. That was inconceivable in the world I grew up in. Inconceivable. My kids would come home, and when they were in elementary school, and I'd say, well, what? Oh, he's mixed. And I thought, what? Where does that come from? Right? So that's a flexibility. Once you dismantle legal segregation, now what you have is economic status of all peoples becomes more important. So are they discriminating against this guy because he's black, or because he's poor, or is it both? That's Brazil. So what you're seeing is this discrimination in American society now becomes more nuanced and subtle.
Did you all see that Skip Gates series, Blacks in Latin America, where he was in Brazil and he walks down and he's in the market and he puts out, everybody puts out their hands, and there were just like 18 names for what everybody was. No, you're not black. He wasn't black in that time. And he's got a new one coming for blacks in the U.S. that's going to be called Many Rivers to Cross after the old Jimmy Cliff song. So.
And Jane's going to be in it. Brett.
Can you put a number on the approximate number of slaves here when legal import stopped in 1808, and then compare that to the number when Lincoln freed the slaves?
Yeah, this is where the United States, this is where we're going to have antebellum U.S. here. Sorry,
oh, dear.
In about 1800, there are about 750,000, 800,000 slaves in the U.S. At that point, there are more slaves in Brazil. The slave traffic is stopped in the United States. When Lincoln emancipates the slaves, there are 4 million slaves. That population grows in about 50 to 60 years 4 times. No other slave society in America comes close to doing this. So this is why in this argument over harshness of slavery, slavery is bad everywhere. But it is interesting in the United States, those slave planters knew if those slaves didn't reproduce, they were out of business. In Brazil, the slave population never even comes close to reproducing itself. Right? You work them, and you bring in new ones. Right? So part of the access for another 50 years to having imported slaves in Brazil probably means the life of the Brazilian slave is nasty, brutish, and short for most of them, right? Because expend them, bring in another one. After 1808, you're a southern planter, and your slaves don't reproduce, you are out of business. So going from roughly 1 million to 4 million in about 60 years is unprecedented in any other slave population in the Americas. So for that brief period from about 1820 to about 1865, the U.S. is the largest slave population in the Americas for that 4 decades.
Following on that, Marshall, did the value of a slave increase exponentially from 1808 because you couldn't get them?
Not exponentially, but it goes up. It is supplying. This is where in Brazil, what you see, is to get slaves after 1850 becomes really more expensive. Because the only place you can get them is internally, and they're not growing. The population is not growing. So that means what you're starting to do is buy off slaves from, say, the Northeast, where the sugar plantations are in relative decadence, to bring them into the coffee plantations in the Southeast, where there's high demand for labor. You can literally see this sort of pulling slaves southward out of the Northeast because you can't import them anymore. So in that sense, this is something the abolitionists actually know is a sort of going to be a consequence if they're successful. If you shut off the traffic, you make those slaves more valuable. And what you're going to do is jack up the price of slaves.
One of the cultural, oh, I'm sorry, I'll slip this in then we'll go. One of the cultural, impacts of all that shutdown of the slave trade is that those American people are becoming less and less African, and so they're losing language, and they're losing culture, and they're losing religious practices, and they're, except for Gullah Geechee on the coast, which we need.
Because they're more isolated.
Because they're isolated, and because they're left relatively alone out there. But mostly, people talk about, the loss of culture, deculturation in the Americans, whereas in all these other places, Africans are being introduced all the time, new groups perhaps, not always the ones that were there before, but at least African languages and practices and skills and whatever are coming in. And there was a young lady there.
It's so much reason for hatred. Is M.L. King's model of non-violent resistance still possible?
Is it possible?
Well, that depends on your political philosophy.
What was the question?
Is Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolence still viable? Is that essentially what you're saying? James Lawson would say yes. Bob?
We're talking about the self-replication, reproduction rate, and the variance between particularly the mining groups in Brazil and southern plantation. What do we know, if anything, about the reproduction rates in the cabildos and the little groups like Melungeons and so on that get off to themselves? Do we know anything at all about those?
Once they're outside the cities, the problem is the data that Bill was mentioning earlier. We just don't have records as much for those people. Archaeology can tell us a certain amount of things, but not demographic data or anything like that, so that does get harder.
This is the fundamental problem of having records. Right? I always say, for you, Sam, it's like, these guys who do U.S. history, as much as they may think they're short on data, it's an abundance of information. I mean, at that same period, say from 1800 to about 1850 in the U.S., where you've got wives of planters keeping diaries and people writing each other and slave narratives and county records and tax records and manuscript censuses, almost none of that exists for Brazil. So that means when I started this small town, I said had a gold mine in it in Brazil. I had sort of the same place across the entire 19th century. I tried to get at this kind of information, and I had probably the best case records. I had this British mining company that was keeping really good records. It is virtually impossible to figure out what, say, infant mortality rates are, life expectancy is. Part of this is people move in, move out, they come, they go.
Names are not recorded with last names,
yeah,
so you have 800 Marias. And
yeah, plus, here's one of my most frustrating moments as a historian. So this British company in the 1830s and 1840s rents large numbers of slaves as the other British companies fail. After 1845, they cannot own slaves, so they rent the slaves.
Another evasion.
Right, so they sign a contract for this group of slaves, a couple of hundred of them, and they make a roster of everybody. So there's a list. And it'll say, Maria, the seamstress, 19, Angola. It's like, oh, wow, I got a whole list, and it tells me where they're from. Then in the 1870s, a Brazilian abolitionist takes up their case. He goes all the way to the Brazilian Supreme Court. He says, these guys signed a contract. They were supposed to free these people after 20 years. So now, decades later, they still have them. The Brazilian Supreme Court says you have to free these guys. So when they free them, they have a list. But then it says, Maria, the seamstress, no age, doesn't tell you what her ethnicity is. So I have two lists filled with Joaos and Marias, and in the first case, the guy was João Mozambique, and the next one, maybe he's João the carpenter. So I cannot, even though I have two lists of the same group of people across time, I can't even match them. So the ability to construct things like mortality rates and also, so this is why you mean things like Fogel and Ingerman, right, who in the 1970s had this notorious book of quantifying everything about slavery. They actually have some data, counting whippings and, you know, how much food these guys are being fed. Almost nothing like that exists for huge sections of slave societies in the Americas. So it's really, really hard to get that kind of comparison. And if people go away and get isolated, like Gullah or Melunge, we have almost nothing until late.
Okay, another reason the Spanish kept records was to keep you out of being a slave family, because if you look at the old names and it would have like 8 last names, that was to keep the family fortune or to get money from the state or from the king or whatever. That's one of the reasons it would have all these last names. And the last one would be Di Bombon because he was a prince or whatever way back when.
Because having names means you matter.
Right. And then another thing about here in the United States, somehow I remember reading about the 1/8 that you were considered black, 1/8. But then if you were 1/16 black, you weren't considered black. You were, there was a term, something like a Jackson White. That was a
Never heard that one.
long.
Andy?
One of the things that I'm interested in, speaking of Marshall's list where the Angola fell out, is that every group that we talked about here, the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the French, sort of had different names for some of these small sets of ethnicities. And I want to, at some point, get somebody to work on, let's make some equivalencies here so that we know who we're talking about. And then it gets even more complicated because I'll have in Cuba, for instance, subsets. So it'll be a hyphenated. You'll have Carabali hyphen Swam. And so Carabali could be the larger group of Calabar people. Swam, I haven't figured out yet what that means. That may be the village or the town or the whatever. But that's going to take a collaborative across the world kind of, figuring system to say, who are these ethnicities? And then the big debate is you sort of can adopt the ones you want to be, So if your dad's Irish and your mom's Italian, how do you identify? Well, the same goes in all of these mixed groups, too. And I found an example in Cuba where the guy joined an ethnic group, and they said, well, why? He was from Philadelphia. He's in Havana. He joined that group and that ethnic group because he liked their drumming best. So,
You want me to mention the St. Genevieve?
Oh, yes, and Paul has a new site to mention to us today.
This weekend, I went to St. Genevieve, Missouri, for an entirely different reason, and discovered that it was a slave colony of the French. And they have records in the exhibit, and there's actually a number of homes there that were built around 1730 to 1750 that you can tour that are state museums. But it was like walking in and discovering what we're studying in this course, and here it is.
That's great.
And they enslaved a number of Indians, but also Africans that they had there.
I think that's another part of that memorialization, that states are starting to realize that this was a big slave trading house here in Mobile or in Pensacola and so on, and now they're making museums out of them and trying to go through the records and pull out what they can to recover that history. So that's one I had never heard of. I'll have to try to Google that and see. So how are we doing for time? I don't know.
Maybe one more.
I'm assuming that the fourfold increase that we saw in the first half of the 19th century was because plantation owners needed to take part of this in order to supply more slaves. Is that a reasonable assumption?
Yeah, I mean, basically, at the most minimal level, first slaves do not reproduce themselves. You have no labor force because your only source of new labor is new kids being born. This is why I say it's as harsh as slavery is. In the U.S., those slave planters knew whatever the threshold level was to allow people to survive, reproduce, and enough of those children to survive the next generations to generate.
What has been their reproduction rate before the plantation?
It's not reproducing. They're reproducing, but it's the absolute number of the population is smaller, and the what would you tell us? The percentage of reproduction is smaller as well. This is something about, when you talk about reproduction, it's the whites. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine and all these guys, we're reproducing like rabbits. If you look at the U.S. in the 18th century, it is phenomenal, the reproduction of the population, even though the conditions are pretty harsh. That's why, when you get back to Bob's question, when I look at these records, what you tend to find almost all these societies, slaves may be having high infant mortality rates, lower, but so are the white populations who are poor. So it's pretty nasty, brutish, and short for just about anybody who's poor. But the conditions of being in slavery are much worse. But these guys, they know that they have to reproduce, have the population reproduce. So that's got to affect the way you treat people to have a threshold level. As harsh you're going to be, you have to have a certain threshold level so you know they're going to survive.
And as a result of that, there are a bunch of these kind of manuals for scientific management of slaves that started to come out in the early 1800s that talk about these issues and how you should have a clean, living condition, and you should provide this amount of food, and you should have wet nurses, and you should have midwives, and you should, because they know the gig is up, or the jig is up, which one is it? And so there's a series of these manuals, and they pride themselves on how scientific and modern they are, that they're going to clean up their acts and do this better, but it's really for the profit margin that they face.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.